Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now let us begin with Story 1, The Seeds of Rome, How a Muddy Village Became a Kingdom. The Tiber River once ran quietly past scattered huts and pastoral fields, long before Rome was a republic, or an empire, or even a dream in the minds of its mythic founders. It was mud. Mud, sheep, and smoke, these were the ingredients of a world that history almost forgot. But nestled somewhere between myth and archaeology lies the slow, unnoticed formation of a place that would one day claim dominion over the known world. Before Romulus and Remus, before the Senate, before Caesar, there was the village. You might imagine Roman greatness sprang forth fully formed, like Athena from the head of Zeus, but no. It squelched, slowly and quietly, out of the hills of Latium. The geography of fortune. Latium was not a paradise. It was a region of modest hills, salty marshes, and awkward coastlines. The soil was rich in places, thanks to volcanic activity, but unpredictable. The Tiber was neither the longest nor the most reliable of rivers, but it was just good enough. It was this just enoughness, not greatness, that gave rise to Rome. History loves to focus on the extraordinary, but civilizations often rise from the merely convenient. This location allowed early settlements to trade with both inland tribes and maritime peoples like the Etruscans and Greeks. It was far enough from the coast to avoid piracy, but close enough for commerce. Rome would later market itself as the city chosen by the gods. In truth, it was chosen by accident and by cattle. The real founders, livestock and mud brick. Archaeological finds suggest that by 1000 BCE, the area of the future Roman Forum was already inhabited, not by heroes but by herders. These pastoralists built huts from wattle and daub mud, straw, and sticks. Their economy ran on sheep, pigs, and above all cows. Not only did livestock provide food and raw materials, but they were the primary currency of wealth and status. The Latin word for money, pecunia, comes from pecus, meaning cattle. These were the curiae, the clans or extended families that gathered on hills and came together for religious rites, trade, and the occasional skirmish. Warfare, such as it was, involved theft, raids, and local vendettas, not the grand campaigns of later centuries. Still, the basic social structures of patronage, obligation, and clientship began here, in the gritty dealings over oxen and land. The first settlements, 7 hills and a pile of dirt. The famous 7 hills of Rome weren't originally one city. They were clusters of tiny communities, each with its own identity, its own hearth gods, and often its own dialect. Over centuries, these hamlets merged for reasons both practical and spiritual. The Palatine, Aventine, and Capitoline hills held the earliest significance, not because they were mighty, but because they were visible. Visibility mattered in a world of oral tradition. If you could see the hill, you could remember the stories. By the 8th century BCE, something began to shift. Burial practices changed, reflecting more complex social hierarchies. Trade increased. Bronze artifacts, imported from far-off lands, began to appear in tombs. Rome was not born, it accumulated. Still, these early people didn't think of themselves as Romans. That idea came later, with language and laws. They were simply villagers, trying to survive in an unpredictable world. The Etruscan influence, culture from the north. To the north of Latium, the Etruscans were building cities, real ones, with walls, sewage systems, and metalworking. The Etruscans would eventually shape much of early Roman religion, art, and even kingship. But at this early stage, they were mysterious trading partners. The influence came gradually. Roman architecture would later mimic Etruscan designs. The toga, that quintessential Roman garment, was likely borrowed from Etruscan fashion. Even the practice of divination, the sacred reading of bird entrails and lightning, owes its origin to them. But influence is not the same as domination. The early Latins were proud and practical. They adopted what worked and quietly discarded the rest. This quiet resistance to full assimilation would become a Roman trait, borrow from the world but never be ruled by it. Rituals and religion, the quiet birth of Roman piety. In these early years, religion was not about gods in the sky, it was about spirits in the ground, in the hearth, and in the river. The Lares and Penates, household gods, were more important than Jupiter. Daily life revolved around appeasing these forces, pouring wine, offering grain, whispering the right words. Religion was not a separate sphere of life, it was embedded in everything. If your crops failed, you offended a spirit. If your child died, you misread an omen. Every act was both mundane and sacred. This fusion of practicality and piety would define Roman culture for centuries. It wasn't about faith, it was about function. The myth of Romulus, memory as politics. The tale of Romulus and Remus, suckled by a she-wolf and raised by shepherds, was likely crafted centuries after the city's actual founding. It served a political purpose, giving Rome a heroic origin. But in the muddy, pig-filled streets of early Latium, there was no wolf, no divine twins. There were only men and women, barefoot in the clay, trading skins and gossip. Still, the myth matters. It tells us what later Romans wanted their origins to be: noble, violent, divine. But the truth was slower, smaller, and more boring. Yet in this slow growth, we see the real miracle. Not gods, but persistence. Not conquest, but continuity. Rome did not emerge in fire, it emerged in patience. Closing reflection. So before Rome became an empire, it was a cluster of huts by a river. Its people worshipped house spirits, traded cows, and buried their dead in urns. There was no senate, no Caesar, no legions. Just mud, fire, and the slow grind of survival. And yet from this, something vast would eventually rise. But how did this village of huts grow powerful enough to become a kingdom, one capable of asserting control over its neighbors and claiming divine right? You left off in the mud. Now imagine that mud, hardening structures forming, rituals deepening, hierarchies emerging. The village on the Tiber was becoming more than a collection of huts. It was evolving into a city-state, one that needed rulers, order, and myth. And so, Rome entered the Age of Kings. This was not yet the Rome of legions and marble columns. It was still smoky fires, thatched roofs, and barefoot children. But power, slow and steady, was forming. A mythic king for a muddy city, Romulus. The first king of Rome, according to tradition, was Romulus. We should pause here to remind ourselves. This is legend stitched together by later Roman historians, not contemporaneous records. There are no scrolls from Romulus' time, no statues carved while he reigned. What we have is the sediment of memory slowly sifted by Livy, Plutarch, and others. Romulus, the wolf-raised twin, is said to have founded Rome in 753 BCE. After killing his brother Remus, he became the city's first ruler. But what matters isn't whether Romulus existed. What matters is what his story told Romans about themselves. That their city was born of violence. That its foundation required sacrifice. That divine providence through Mars, the god of war, favored them. Romulus allegedly organized the population into tribes, established the Senate, and invited neighboring Sabines to populate the new city. The infamous rape of the Sabine women, where Roman men abducted and married women from a neighboring tribe, was remembered not as barbarism, but as strategy. To Romans, pragmatism often justified cruelty. But was there truly a Romulus? Likely not. Yet there was certainly a monarch, and likely many of them. Kings, real and imagined. Rome's monarchy lasted for around 240 years and included 7 kings, according to tradition. Each is associated with specific developments in Roman society. Whether these figures were individuals or composite representations of broader cultural shifts, they reflected a city slowly becoming a polity. Let's explore a few notable figures slowly, methodically, and with the quiet respect due to boring but foundational history. Numa Pompilius, the priest king. Numa Pompilius was Rome's second king, said to be Sabine in origin and deeply pious. His reign, real or embellished, marked a stark contrast to Romulus' militarism. Numa is credited with founding many of Rome's religious institutions. The Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest. The Vestal Virgins, guardians of the eternal flame. The Temple of Janus, whose doors stayed closed in times of peace. It is tempting to romanticize Numa's peaceful rule, but his reforms were about control as much as faith. Religion wasn't separate from governance. It was governance. Through ritual calendars, taboos, and festivals, he standardized behavior. The Romans wouldn't say, obey the law, they'd say, observe the rites. And thus, power in Rome was not just held by the sword, but by the calendar. Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius, war and infrastructure. After Numa's reign, Tullus Hostilius returned to violence. His legendary destruction of Alba Longa, Rome's supposed ancestral rival, symbolized Rome's assertion of dominance in Latium. He is credited with establishing military discipline, building the first Senate house, Curia Hostilia, expanding the population through conquest. His successor, Ancus Marcius, blended aggression with administration. Under his reign, the port of Ostia was founded. Rome gained access to salt pans essential for food preservation and trade. The Pons Sublicius, Rome's first bridge across the Tiber, was built. We see here the rhythm of Roman growth. War, followed by civic order. Expansion was never just about land, it was about incorporating people, roads, and rituals into Rome's growing orbit. Servius Tullius, the bureaucratic king. Perhaps the most fascinating of the early kings was Servius Tullius. His reign marked a turning point toward structured governance. He is credited with conducting the first census, a revolutionary concept for managing citizens, property, and military service. Dividing society into classes based on wealth, not just birth. Organizing the Comitia Centuriata, an assembly where voting was weighted by class. Servius' innovations were bureaucratic in the purest sense, paperwork as power, or more accurately, stone tablets and spoken formulas as power. Rome began to rule not just with muscle, but with measurement. Even the city's physical layout was reshaped. The Servian Wall allegedly encircled the city, creating a new sense of identity, not just a collection of hills, but a single urban space. But Servius, like many reformers, met a violent end. He was assassinated, likely by his own son-in-law, paving the way for Rome's final monarch. Tarquinius Superbus, the arrogance of kings. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, was the last king of Rome. His story is a lesson in the decay of absolute power. He ruled without the Senate's approval, expanded Roman territory, and built Rome's first grand temple, the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. But his downfall came from tyranny, not triumph. The catalyst for revolution was the rape of Lucretia, a noblewoman, by Tarquin's son. Her suicide sparked outrage and gave Rome its founding trauma. Monarchy equals corruption. In 509 BCE, the monarchy was overthrown. Rome would never again accept a king. Or so they claimed. A kingdom without a crown. What followed was the res publica, a public thing, a republic. Yet the monarchy's legacy endured in strange ways. The Rex Sacrorum, king of rituals, preserved some royal religious roles. The Senate, first formed under Romulus, now held real power. Consuls wore symbols of kingship, purple togas, curule chairs. Rome rejected monarchy, but inherited its tools. Still, the transition wasn't clean. Power doesn't evaporate, it reorganizes. Families that once supported kings now became patricians. Authority moved from the crown to the committee. And so, with the kings gone, the republic began. But it began with the same people, the same gods, and the same muddy streets. Closing reflection. The story of Rome's early kings is not just a tale of rulers and rituals. It is a story of structure, of how small, disorganized communities build meaning through myth, bureaucracy, and belief. The monarchy didn't just rule Rome, it formed it. But as Rome shed its kings, it embraced a new experiment, rule by the people, or at least by the wealthy ones. A republic was born in violence, like its kingdom before it. Yet the question remains, could this new republic, messy, divided, and elitist, truly avoid the corruption that doomed its kings? As the final king of Rome was forced into exile, the dust of revolution settled over the Tiber. The smoke from the temples of Jupiter still rose, and the grain still ground in the hand mills of the poor. The Roman people, accustomed to being ruled by kings, whether wise, priestly, or cruel, now faced a new question: how to govern without a crown. But Rome, as always, changed gradually. The end of monarchy was not the start of freedom. It was the start of something even more complicated: the Republic. The overthrow, myth and memory. The end of the monarchy is traditionally dated to 509 BCE. This tidy date is a historical convenience. Revolutions rarely announce themselves so cleanly. According to legend, Lucius Junius Brutus led the revolt against King Tarquin the Proud after the rape and suicide of Lucretia. The story, whether myth, memory, or moral fable, offered a clear narrative. The people rose against tyranny and cast out their corrupt king. But underneath the drama was a more bureaucratic truth. Power was never evenly distributed. It simply shifted from one office to another, from one family to another. Brutus and his allies did not create a democracy. They created a republic, res publica, the public thing. Rule by law, rule by citizens, but especially rule by elite citizens. And the first thing they did was replace the king with two consuls, dual magistrates with shared power and term limits. It was a symbolic rejection of monarchy, but it was still rule. Kings without crowns, the first consuls. The early consuls wielded nearly identical powers to those of the kings, but with one key difference. They ruled for a single year, not for life, and they could veto each other. This strange system of balance was designed to prevent another Tarquin, but it also reflected Rome's obsession with checks and rituals. The Republic was not founded on trust, it was built to contain mistrust. The first consuls, Brutus and Collatinus, had to navigate a city still emotionally tied to its royal past. Collatinus, despite his role in the revolution, was forced to resign because he shared the same family name, Tarquinius, as the deposed king. The people did not want even the echo of monarchy. The vestiges of kingship. Still, royal traditions endured. Rome kept many of the trappings of the monarchy, repurposed into republican form. The lictors, those silent figures carrying bundles of rods, fasces, to signify power, still accompanied the consuls. The curule chair, the ivory seat of authority, remained a symbol of office. The imperium, the abstract right to command, still flowed from religious ritual. Even more revealing, the rex sacrorum, or king of sacred things, was created to preserve royal religious functions. He held no political power but conducted ancient rites. Rome had killed the king but not the idea of kingship. These symbolic roles served a function: to remind the people that Rome's identity was rooted in tradition, not just change. The struggle of the orders, republic for whom? The early republic was not democratic, it was oligarchic. The Senate, composed of aristocratic patres fathers, retained control of legislation, diplomacy, and finance. The vast majority of Romans, the plebeians, had limited rights. They were farmers, soldiers, and tradesmen. They could vote in assemblies but were largely shut out from meaningful power. This imbalance gave rise to a long, grinding internal conflict, the struggle of the orders. Starting around 494 BCE, the plebeians began to demand more. Their tactics were subtle but effective. They organized mass secessions, literally leaving the city and refusing to serve in the military unless granted concessions. Their demands were clear: legal protection, access to political office, relief from debt slavery. Over the next 2 centuries, plebeians would win the right to elect their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs, with power to veto magistrates. Eventually, laws were written down, the 12 tables. Intermarriage was legalized, and plebeians gained access to the consulship itself. It was not a revolution. It was a negotiation measured in generations. The symbolism of the 12 tables. One of the most pivotal early republican reforms was the codification of law. In 451–450 BCE, after decades of elite monopoly on legal knowledge, Rome created the 12 tables, laws etched onto bronze and posted in the Forum for all to see. This act didn't solve inequality, but it defined it. Now a plebeian could know if they were being wronged. Knowledge became a shield, however thin. The laws themselves were harsh, and sometimes strange debtors could be dismembered, and women were perpetually under male guardianship, but they represented a move toward clarity. Rome was now a place where rules, not rulers, held sway. External threats and internal consolidation. During this period, Rome's politics were mirrored by military realities. The early republic was constantly at war with neighboring Latin tribes, with the Etruscans, and eventually with the Gauls. War, oddly, helped unify the Roman people. Plebeians, though politically marginalized, were essential soldiers. Their blood helped expand Roman territory, and their sacrifices gave moral weight to their political demands. Victories brought new land and spoils distributed unevenly, of course, but enough to create loyalty. Rome was becoming more than a city. It was becoming an idea, an identity tied not to monarchy or family, but to a shared legal and military destiny. The long shadow of kingship. Though Rome officially banned monarchy, its fascination with authority never disappeared. Even as they built the Republic, Romans retained a deep respect for strong, singular figures so long as they didn't call themselves rex. The office of dictator was a legal loophole in the republican structure. In times of crisis, a single man could be appointed with absolute power for 6 months. The first known use of this office came during military emergencies. It was meant to be temporary, but it planted a dangerous precedent, the idea that tyranny could be legal if properly timed. The seeds of empire were already buried in the Republic's foundation. Closing reflection. By the end of the monarchy and the formation of the Republic, Rome had transformed socially, politically, and structurally. The king was gone, but his shadow stretched long across the Tiber. Rome's genius was never in radical change, but in adaptation. It kept the rituals of kingship while building a system to contain it. It elevated law but allowed inequality. It feared tyranny but made room for emergency power. And so, the Republic was born not in pure liberty, but in compromise. Yet one question lingers. How long could such a fragile balance between patrician and plebeian, law and ambition truly hold? Story 2. The 12 Tables, Rome's first laws and the politics of order. You find yourself in the Roman Forum, not as it would later be a grand space of temples and triumphs, but as it was in the 5th century BCE, dusty, chaotic, contested. It is not yet a city of marble. It is a city of friction. Merchants shout prices over carts, debtors argue with creditors, slaves stand by their masters, and in the middle of it all a question persists. What is the law? Not in theory but in practice. Can a man be jailed for missing a debt payment? Can a woman inherit land? Can a slave buy freedom? The answers depend not on a public text but on the memories and decisions of aristocrats. The law lives in the mouths of patricians, and that is precisely the problem. The problem of oral law. In early Republican Rome, legal knowledge was closely guarded by the aristocratic class, the patricians. These were the descendants of the oldest families, often former kingmakers and still power brokers. Law to them was not a universal rule book, it was tradition, interpretation, and above all, advantage. If a plebeian, one of the vast majority of commoners, was accused of a crime or sued in a civil matter, they had no written code to consult. Legal procedures were arcane, preserved by pontiffs and elite jurists. A plebeian might show up in court and be told they violated a ritual or breached a contract they didn't know existed. The imbalance was not just political, it was epistemological. The elite knew the law, everyone else obeyed it. This wasn't sustainable. Seeds of reform, the plebeian push. By the early 5th century BCE, the struggle of the orders, that slow, grinding negotiation between patricians and plebeians, was already underway. The plebeians had formed their own political representatives, the tribunes, and were steadily pushing for reforms. One of their primary demands was transparency. They wanted the laws to be written down, published, and fixed, not interpreted ad hoc by the elite. They wanted to end the phrase, "we have always done it this way," and replace it with, "here is the rule." This was a revolutionary idea, not because it created new laws, but because it made them visible. But like all Roman reforms, it came slowly and in stages. The first step, the decemvirate. In 451 BCE, after much pressure, the Senate agreed to a temporary and radical experiment: the suspension of all regular magistrates and the appointment of a special commission, 10 men, or decemviri, tasked with writing down Rome's laws. These men were given total authority for 1 year. No consuls, no tribunes, no vetoes, just the decemviri. This was both a legal innovation and a potential danger. Power, even for noble purposes, can easily overreach. But for now, the people accepted the risk, hoping for clarity. The first decemvirate completed their task diligently. They produced 10 bronze tablets of laws covering procedures, property, inheritance, and punishments. These tablets were posted in the forum for all to read. It was quite literally a monumental shift. What the 12 tables contained. The original 12 tables, 2 more, were added the following year, are mostly lost to time, but fragments survive in the writings of later historians and legal scholars. What emerges from these pieces is a legal code that is practical. It focuses on property disputes, contracts, debts, marriage, and penalties. Harsh, many punishments involve death, exile, or physical mutilation. Socially stratified, it recognizes class distinctions. What is allowed for patricians might not be for plebeians. A few notable laws include debt and slavery. If a debtor failed to pay, they could be held in chains for 60 days, then sold into slavery or executed. Marriage and inheritance. Strict rules governed how property passed between male heirs. Trial rights. Citizens were granted the right to face accusers and present a defense, a primitive but real legal protection. Limits on women. Women were perpetual minors in the eyes of the law, always under male guardianship unless legally freed. Religious regulation. Certain days were banned for legal proceedings, a reflection of Rome's deeply intertwined civil and religious life. Importantly, the laws were not fair by modern standards, but fairness wasn't the goal. Predictability was. Now at least, every citizen could see the law. Law as a tool of stability. Why did the patricians allow this? Partially because they had no choice. Plebeian resistance, including refusal to fight in wars or serve in civic duties, had created gridlock. But also because the elite realized something crucial. Written law preserved the republic. By fixing the rules, they prevented chaos. And by making them public, they ensured that no future demagogue could rewrite them at will. In this way, the 12 tables served both classes. They limited abuses from above and rebellions from below. Rome, once again, found stability through compromise. A cultural shift, law and identity. The impact of the 12 tables went beyond politics. They began to define what it meant to be Roman. To be a citizen was not just to speak Latin or serve in the army, it was to live under these laws. Roman parents had their sons memorize parts of the tables. The rules became catechism. Law became more than policy, it became culture. Even centuries later, Roman orators and philosophers like Cicero would reference the 12 tables as sacred foundations, more enduring than poetry, more essential than architecture. Rome's greatness, they claimed, lay not in conquest but in codification. Closing reflection. In a city still ruled by elite families, in a society where women were marginalized and debt could mean enslavement, one might ask, what truly changed with the 12 tables? The answer is not utopia, but order. Rome did not solve its inequalities, but it made them visible, and in doing so, it created the conditions for resistance, negotiation, and eventual reform. The written law, etched into bronze and posted in the Forum, whispered to every Roman, "Here is what we expect. Here is what you can demand." But the story does not end with the laws being posted. Because the second decemvirate, tasked with completing the code, would not relinquish power so easily. So what happens when those who write the law decide to rule by it and beyond it? The Roman Forum now holds 12 tablets, bronze slabs mounted in public view, reflecting sunlight and symbolizing a radical transformation. The law, once secret and sacred, is now written and shared. The people rejoice, for the unknown has been named. But power, once given, rarely returns quietly. Rome's experiment with codified law was only halfway done. The second decemvirate, tasked with completing the 12 tables, would not stop at legal reform. Their example would reveal an unsettling truth. Even a republic devoted to order is vulnerable when law becomes a shield for tyranny. The rise of the second decemvirate. In 450 BCE, the first set of 10 tablets was complete, yet legal gaps remained. Certain religious, family, and procedural laws had not been addressed. So a second group of decemviri, 10 new men, including some from the previous group, was appointed to finish the job. These men held the same absolute power. No consuls, no tribunes, no appeal. The theory was that their work would conclude within the year. But the second decemvirate did not disband when their task was finished. In fact, they completed only 2 more tablets, bringing the total to 12, but refused to step down. Their reason: the work is not yet done. Their real motive: power unopposed. The 12 tables, ironically, had not provided for the illegal extension of authority. The law was codified, but its authors had slipped outside it. The mask of legality. The decemviri ruled with increasing severity. What had begun as a commission became an autocracy. They dressed like magistrates, they held court, they made judgments, but they also silenced opposition, ignored appeals, and ruled by decree. Rome had abolished monarchy just half a century earlier, but now, in the heart of the Republic, it had unknowingly installed 10 kings. The Senate murmured but acted cautiously. Many senators had family ties to the decemviri. Some believed the situation would resolve itself. Others feared civil unrest. Meanwhile, the people, especially the plebeians, grew restless. Their tribunes had been suspended during the Decemvirate. They had no official protection, no legal advocate. And then came Appius Claudius. Appius Claudius, architect and tyrant. Appius Claudius was the most prominent member of both Decemvirates. A patrician of ambition and cunning, he had reinvented himself as a man of the people during the first term. But once entrenched in power, he revealed a darker disposition. Under his influence, the Decemviri began issuing judgments favoring elite interests, expanding property claims and persecuting critics. But it was a single, devastating incident that ignited revolt. The case of Virginia. Virginia was a young plebeian woman, betrothed to a soldier and daughter of Lucius Virginius, a respected centurion. Appius Claudius desired her. When persuasion failed, he turned to legal manipulation. In court, his associate claimed Virginia was actually a slave, born to his household and thus his property. With no tribunes to intercede and with Appius acting as judge, the claim was upheld. In desperation, Lucius Virginius rushed back from the military camp. In the forum, as crowds gathered, he pleaded for his daughter's release. Denied, he drew a concealed knife. Before his daughter could be taken into slavery, he killed her, striking her down before the very tablets of law meant to protect her. The forum fell silent. Then it erupted. The second secession of the plebs. The death of Virginia became a rallying cry. For the second time in Republican history, the plebeians seceded. They marched to the Sacred Mount, withdrawing their labor, their soldiers, and their loyalty. This was not rebellion, it was pressure. Without its citizen soldiers, Rome was defenseless, and the Senate knew it. Negotiations began. The plebeians demanded the end of the Decemvirate, the restoration of the tribunes of the plebs, and legal accountability for Appius Claudius and his allies. The Senate agreed. The Decemviri resigned. Some went into exile. Appius Claudius, facing trial, allegedly died by suicide or was executed quietly, depending on which historian you read. The Republic had reasserted itself. The return of the tribunes. With the Decemvirate disbanded, Rome reinstated its traditional offices. But this time, the tribunes came back stronger. The Lex Valeria Horatia, passed in 449 BCE, did something profound. It restored the right of provocatio, or appeal to the people against the actions of magistrates. It also formally recognized the plebiscita laws passed by the plebeian assembly as binding on all citizens, including patricians. This was not merely symbolic. It began the process of elevating plebeian political authority, which would continue for 2 more centuries. Rome's structure of power consuls, tribunes, assemblies was now stabilized, but more importantly, its culture had shifted. The people had forced accountability not by rebellion, but by withdrawal. The legacy of the 12 Tables. Though born in tension and nearly destroyed by ambition, the 12 Tables endured. They became Rome's first true constitution, not comprehensive, not egalitarian, but foundational. For generations, Roman schoolchildren memorized the laws as part of their education. Jurists cited them. Orators referenced them. They were consulted in disputes, inscribed in public memory, and copied for distant provinces. Even as new laws emerged, the 12 Tables remained symbolic anchors. They represented the idea that no one, not even a king or a patrician magistrate, was above the written word. Their influence stretched far beyond Rome. Centuries later, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the basis of modern civil law in Europe, would draw on their principles. Even in our modern legal systems, echoes of the tables remain. Closing reflection. Rome's experiment with writing down its laws began as a compromise. It became a crisis, and ultimately it reshaped the Republic. The 12 Tables did not guarantee justice. They did not prevent tyranny, but they made tyranny visible. and that visibility created the conditions for resistance, negotiation, and institutional evolution. And so we are left with a question that Roman citizens, senators, and soldiers alike would have wrestled with. Is law more powerful than the men who write it? By the time the Roman Republic reached its stride, the original bronze tablets of the 12 Tables were weathered, and their creators long dead. Yet their words echoed not only through the Forum, but across centuries of Roman governance, education, and identity. Rome did not forget the 12 Tables because Rome could not forget them. We explore how a humble set of legal codes rooted in compromise, conflict, and crisis transcended their moment to become cultural bedrock, and how they influenced the slow, deliberate machinery of Roman justice for generations. From bronze to bedrock. Though etched in metal, the 12 Tables were never meant to be static. Roman law evolved constantly. New laws were passed, procedures amended, legal loopholes discovered and closed. But through it all, the 12 Tables were treated as sacred origin. Jurists from the Republic to the Empire quoted them. Teachers drilled them into schoolboys. Senators invoked them in debate. Even emperors acknowledged their authority not because they were perfect, but because they were first. They were memory made material. And in a society where history and tradition carried the force of moral law, that mattered deeply. Law and the shaping of Roman society. The legal philosophy that grew from the 12 Tables emphasized a few key principles that would define Roman life for the next 800 years. 1. Legalism and formalism. Roman law emphasized form. Contracts, wills, and trials were defined by strict procedures. A legal agreement was binding only if stated in exactly the right words. Ceremony mattered. Even a single misstep in a ritual could invalidate a proceeding. This was not bureaucracy for its own sake, it was a defense against abuse. When law lives in form, it is harder to manipulate by whim. 2. Property as power. The Tables were obsessed with land, boundaries, inheritance, and debt. Property disputes were given primacy over more abstract crimes. This reflected a society in which status was measured in acres, not titles. Legal innovations over time, from land reform laws to limits on debt bondage, all emerged within this frame. Rome did not seek to eliminate inequality, but to organize it. 3. Punishment and deterrence. The laws were famously harsh. Debtors could be enslaved. Thieves could be whipped or executed. But these punishments were not arbitrary, they were predictable. In a society with little policing and minimal state apparatus, the law had to be its own deterrent. Severity was a feature, not a bug. Yet over time, the Republic would temper these extremes. Tribunes could block unjust rulings. Appeal to the people became normal. Mercy entered the system, but always after order had been secured. Education and the law. By the 3rd century BCE, Roman boys were taught to recite the 12 Tables from memory. Education was not standardized, but for the sons of citizens especially, the elite memorizing law was as basic as learning to count. Why? Because to be a Roman was to know the law. Citizenship was not merely military or geographic, it was legal. This emphasis helped create an unusually legalistic culture. Even in the most violent periods of the Republic, Roman leaders sought justification in precedent, interpretation, and process. Politics could be bloody, but the language of politics was always legal. The expansion of law across the Republic. As Rome grew beyond the city-state and began absorbing Italy, then the Mediterranean, the question arose: how do you govern people who are Roman? The 12 Tables provided part of the answer, but only part. New laws, such as the Ius Gentium law of peoples, were developed to deal with foreigners. These drew from Roman law but also from local customs, creating a kind of hybrid legal system. Rome didn't impose uniformity, it imposed structure. The tables remained the gold standard for Roman citizens, but their spirit of predictability, transparency, and control shaped the laws written for everyone else. Law as a tool of imperial management. During the later Republic and especially under the Empire, the legal system became vast, technical, and professional. Lawyers, jurisprudents, and magistrates consulted centuries of legal precedents. But the foundation never disappeared. Even as new edicts, senatorial decrees, and imperial rulings layered complexity onto the system, the 12 tables were kept alive in commentary, tradition, and cultural imagination. When Cicero, the great orator and legal theorist, praised the 12 tables as surpassing all the libraries of the philosophers, he was speaking to Rome's obsession with law as identity. The expansion of empire, the rule of distant provinces, and the management of millions all depended not just on the sword, but on the scroll. Decay and preservation. The physical tablets of the 12 tables were lost sometime during the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BCE, or possibly even later. No one knows exactly when. But their content endured. Roman scholars reconstructed them from memory and quotations. Over time, their wording was standardized. In the digest of Justinian compiled in the 6th century CE, the 12 tables are still referenced, even as they sat under centuries of legal sediment. They were precedent even when lost. The legacy in later civilizations. The influence of the 12 tables did not end with Rome. In medieval Europe, Roman law revived and reinterpreted formed the basis of civil law traditions in countries like France, Germany, and Italy. The Napoleonic Code, the Prussian Civil Code, and eventually modern civil law systems all drew from Roman legal structure. Even today, principles like the right to face your accuser, equal application of the law, the recognition of contracts, legal guardianship, can be traced back, in concept if not exact wording, to those early bronze tablets in the Roman Forum. Closing reflection. The 12 tables were born out of necessity, designed to calm a city divided, to expose the law to the public, and to stabilize a republic still learning how to govern. They were imperfect, harsh, and unequal, but they did something extraordinary. They made the law visible. And that visibility changed everything. Because once the law is written down, it can be read. Once it can be read, it can be remembered. And once it can be remembered, it can be challenged. The question that echoes across centuries through every courthouse and codex, every reform and rebellion is the same one Rome first answered in bronze. If the law is for all, then who decides what it says? Story 3. Grain, Gods, and Grievances. The Roman Republic in Crisis. By the 3rd century BCE, the Roman Republic had transformed from a modest city-state into a regional power. Its armies had driven back rival Latin tribes, defeated the Etruscans, subdued the Samnites, and taken the wealthy Greek colonies in southern Italy. Victory, however, was not free. With every conquest came new land, new wealth, and new problems. These problems, rooted in inequality, agriculture, religion, and power, would slowly push the republic to its limits. And while they would not cause its immediate fall, they set in motion the long decay that would one day lead to dictatorship, civil war, and the end of republican liberty. It begins not with a battle, but with a question of bread. The agrarian backbone of the republic. The Roman Republic was, at heart, an agricultural society. Despite its growing cities and military reach, the vast majority of citizens were rural farmers, smallholders who owned or rented plots of land and labored on them alongside their families. These plebeian farmers formed the foundation of Roman society. They supplied grain to the cities. They served in the legions. They voted in assemblies when they could travel to Rome. But as Rome conquered more territory, the structure of its economy began to shift. War brought spoils. Spoils brought slaves. Slaves replaced free labor, and the small farmer, the traditional citizen soldier, began to disappear. This change did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, over decades, in a series of seemingly unrelated events, but the pattern was unmistakable. The problem of latifundia. The lands seized in conquest were often declared ager publicus, public land controlled by the state. In theory, these lands were to be distributed among citizens, especially poor plebeians. In practice, they were often absorbed by Rome's wealthiest citizens, the patricians and equestrians, who turned them into vast estates known as latifundia. These estates were worked not by citizens, but by slaves captured in Rome's endless wars and imported in staggering numbers. In some regions of Italy, slaves made up nearly half the population. As slave labor replaced free labor, small farmers found themselves squeezed out, unable to compete, often forced to sell their land and drift into the cities, particularly Rome. Thus began the slow formation of a new class, urban poor, dependent on grain subsidies and politically volatile. The growing grain crisis. With so many citizens now landless and unemployed, Rome faced a mounting crisis: how to feed its own people. The state began distributing grain at subsidized rates or sometimes for free. What began as an emergency measure became an institution, the annona. This grain dole was both a welfare system and a political tool. Tribunes and magistrates who proposed generous grain laws gained enormous popularity with the plebs. Those who tried to reduce it faced riots. Rome's economy, built on conquest, now depended on imported grain, especially from Sicily, Sardinia, and eventually Egypt. This left the city vulnerable to shortages, blockades, or corruption. The Republic was being fed but not nourished. Religion and ritual in a changing society. As material pressures mounted, Rome turned, as it often did, to the gods. Religion in the Republic was deeply entwined with politics. Every law, election, or military campaign had to be blessed by auspices. Priests were magistrates. Temples were government buildings. But in the 2nd century BCE, Roman religion began to shift. New cults, imported from Greece and the East, gained popularity especially among the poor and marginalized. Mystery religions like the cult of Bacchus, Dionysus, offered personal salvation, ecstatic rituals, and emotional connection, something missing in Rome's rigid public rites. The Senate saw these cults as threats. In 186 BCE, it launched a brutal crackdown on the Bacchanalia, claiming they encouraged vice, sedition, and conspiracy. What was really happening was fear. Fear that Rome's traditional structures, legal, social, and religious, were no longer binding the people together. Corruption in the provinces. As Rome expanded, it governed its new territories through a patchwork system of provinces, administered by magistrates and their staff. These provincial governors, former consuls or praetors, had broad powers to tax, judge, and command military forces. In theory, they were accountable to the Senate. In practice, many enriched themselves at the expense of local populations. There were few checks on corruption. Trials for misconduct, called repetendi, existed but were rare, and juries were drawn from the same aristocratic class as the accused. The provinces became piggy banks for Rome's elite, feeding fortunes back to the capital, financing political careers, and increasing resentment across the empire. The army as a political force. Rome's army had once been composed of land-owning citizens serving out of duty, but as more citizens became landless, the recruitment base narrowed. Meanwhile, long foreign campaigns discouraged traditional service. To fill the ranks, commanders began recruiting from the poor, promising loot, land, and glory. These soldiers were not tied to the Republic. They were loyal to their generals. This shift would have catastrophic consequences in the following century, but its roots lay here in a republic that no longer knew how to reward service with stability. The Senate's paralysis. The Roman Senate, once a body of wisdom and restraint, was increasingly dominated by wealthy aristocrats more interested in personal advancement than public service. It resisted reform, blocked land redistribution, and treated popular assemblies with contempt. When tribunes tried to pass measures to alleviate poverty or curb elite power, they were often met with violence or obstruction. The Senate no longer governed by consensus, it ruled by inertia. And yet in the eyes of the elite, this was order. Closing reflection. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic stood at the height of its external power and on the edge of internal collapse. Its cities were swelling with the landless poor. Its economy depended on slavery and conquest. Its religion no longer united its people. Its government served the few, not the many. And yet, the system endured, patched by compromise, masked by tradition, and held together by the sheer momentum of expansion. But how long can a republic survive when its citizens no longer believe it serves them? And when the people cry for justice, what happens when those in power refuse to listen? The Roman Republic, now bloated with the spoils of conquest, had begun to turn inward. The cracks beneath the marble landless citizens, corrupt governance, foreign wars were no longer invisible. But as always in Rome, action would require tragedy. Enter the Gracchi brothers. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were not revolutionaries in appearance. They were members of the nobility, educated, eloquent, and deeply Roman, but they saw clearly what others refused to acknowledge, that the republic's structure no longer served the people it claimed to represent. Their efforts to fix the system, to redistribute land, reform the courts, and revive republican values would shake Rome to its foundations. And in doing so, they would reveal just how fragile the republic had become. Tiberius Gracchus, land for the poor. In 133 BCE, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs, a position originally created to protect common citizens from elite abuse. Tiberius' primary concern was land. He had served in Spain and seen firsthand how veterans returned to Rome with no farms, no income, and no support. Meanwhile, elite families controlled enormous estates, often illegally, on public land. Tiberius proposed a bold solution: revive an old law that limited the amount of public land, ager publicus, a person could hold. Excess land would be seized and redistributed to the poor. This lex agraria was not a radical new idea, but it directly threatened the wealth of Rome's most powerful families, and they responded with fury. Breaking the norms. Tiberius pushed the bill directly to the concilium plebis, the plebeian assembly, bypassing the Senate. When his fellow tribune, Marcus Octavius, vetoed the proposal, Tiberius had him removed from office, an unprecedented move. In Roman politics, procedure was sacred. To violate it, even for good cause, was dangerous. But Tiberius believed the stakes were too high. He succeeded in passing the law. A land commission was created. Families lined up for small plots, but the Senate, bitter and humiliated, delayed funding, obstructed implementation, and sought revenge. Tiberius then made another controversial move. He ran for a second term as tribune. Re-election was not illegal, but it was considered improper. Rome's political culture was built on rotation, not continuity. The Senate feared he was trying to make himself king. On the day of the vote, a group of senators led by the Pontifex Maximus, Scipio Nasica, stormed the assembly. Tiberius was beaten to death with wooden chairs. He was the first Roman politician to be murdered in office. Gaius Gracchus, more than land. A decade later, in 123 BCE, Gaius Gracchus Tiberius' younger brother was elected tribune. He had learned from his brother's fate. He moved faster, more strategically, and with broader ambitions. Gaius passed a series of reforms. Grain law, subsidized grain for all citizens, a stabilizing force for the poor, and a blow to elite grain speculators. Judicial reform, transferred control of corruption trials from senators to equestrians, wealthy non-senators who were more independent. Land redistribution, continued his brother's land program. Military reform, required the state to provide equipment to soldiers, reducing the burden on the poor. Colonial expansion, proposed establishing colonies for landless citizens, including one at Carthage. He even proposed granting citizenship rights to Rome's Latin allies, a move seen as dangerously inclusive. The Senate watched with alarm. The fall of Gaius Gracchus. Gaius sought re-election and won again, a rare feat, but the tide turned. In his third year, amid political backlash and public unrest, the Senate took action. Using an emergency decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, they gave the consul Lucius Opimius authority to restore order, by any means necessary. A mob formed on the Aventine Hill. Gaius and a small group of followers fled. As soldiers approached, Gaius ordered his slave to kill him, choosing death over dishonor. Thousands of his supporters were executed in the aftermath. The Republic had now normalized political murder. The meaning of the Gracchi. The Gracchi brothers did not propose revolution. They sought reform within the Republic. They used existing laws, offices, and assemblies, but they challenged elite control, and for that, they were destroyed. Their deaths marked a turning point. Violence had entered Roman politics. The Senate had shown it would kill to preserve power, and future leaders, populars and optimates alike, took note. The Roman people, once energized by the promise of reform, were now cynical and divided. The divide between plebs and patricians had become a chasm. Echoes of collapse. In the decades following the Gracchi, the social war would erupt over the question of citizenship for Italian allies. Generals like Marius and Sulla would use the army as a political weapon. The Senate would swing between paralysis and repression. Street violence, intimidation, and political assassination would become common. Rome remained powerful but brittle. The cult of memory. Ironically, the Gracchi became heroes after death. Statues were raised, speeches invoked their names. Their mother, Cornelia, became a symbol of republican virtue, the mother of the Gracchi, who raised reformers with courage and dignity. The brothers were mourned not just as martyrs, but as warnings. What happens when a republic is unwilling to reform? What happens when law exists, but is used only to protect the powerful? Closing reflection. The Gracchi brothers did not destroy the Republic, but their lives and their deaths revealed how close to the edge it already stood. They saw a system that served the few and tried to repair it. They used laws, not weapons, but the Republic, unwilling to bend, chose to break them instead. Their legacy lived on not in the reforms they passed, most of which were reversed, but in the lesson their story taught. That when a republic fears its own people, its days are numbered. By the late 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic was no longer a system drifting into crisis. It was a system defined by crisis. The reforms of the Gracchi had been buried first in paperwork, then in blood. Yet the problems they had tried to address remained. The rural poor were landless, the urban poor were restless, the Senate was entrenched, and the military was on the cusp of transformation. But the most dangerous change of all was not in law or economy, it was in expectation. The Gracchi had shattered the illusion that the Republic was inviolable. Once blood had been spilled in the Forum, it became easier to spill it again. Rome was not yet an empire, But it was no longer a republic of trust. It had become a republic of calculation. Marius and the rise of the professional army. Gaius Marius was a novus homo, a new man without noble ancestry. His rise through Roman politics was remarkable not just for his background, but for what it signaled, that power could be won not just through family, but through the army. In 107 BCE, Marius was elected consul to lead Rome's war in Numidia. To raise troops, he did something revolutionary. He allowed landless citizens to enlist men who, under traditional law, were too poor to serve. This broke a centuries-old precedent, but it was effective. For the first time, soldiers were no longer landowners defending their homes. They were professional fighters, often poor, who depended on their generals for pay, spoils, and retirement land. Their loyalty shifted not to the republic, but to the commander who fed them. Rome had found a new source of military manpower and a new threat to its political order. The Jugurthan War, corruption exposed. Marius' rise came during the Jugurthan War, 112–105 BCE, fought against Jugurtha, the king of Numidia. The war exposed Rome's vulnerability to elite corruption. Jugurtha had bribed Roman senators to avoid punishment. When finally captured, he is said to have exclaimed, "Rome is a city for sale, and doomed to perish if it finds a buyer." The Roman public agreed. Outrage over the Senate's failure to manage the war helped Marius win repeated consulships, 6 in total, a direct challenge to the idea that power should rotate. Tradition was giving way to utility. The Cimbrian threat and the militarization of politics. Following the Jugurthan War, Rome faced new threats from migrating Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons. These battles, particularly the crushing defeats at Arausio in 105 BCE, shocked the Republic. Marius, again appointed consul, reorganized the army. He created standardized units. He improved discipline and logistics. He solidified the idea of a career army. Marius' reforms saved Rome from military disaster, but they also reinforced a dangerous precedent, that in times of crisis, the system bends to the individual who delivers results. And when the crisis passed, the Republic was left more centralized, more militarized, and more reliant on charismatic leaders. Saturninus and the return of political violence. In the 100s BCE, Rome saw a disturbing trend. Tribunes, once protectors of the people, were increasingly using their office to challenge the Senate by force. Lucius Apuleius Saturninus, an ally of Marius, passed popular laws through the assembly by mobilizing gangs, intimidating opponents, and defying senatorial norms. In response, the Senate revived the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the same emergency decree used to kill Gaius Gracchus. Marius, though formerly an ally, was tasked with restoring order. Saturninus was cornered and killed, another tribune destroyed by the very republic he had tried to use for reform. The cycle was becoming familiar: reform, obstruction, violence, repression. The tribunate becomes a battleground. Throughout the 90s BCE, the tribunate, originally a voice for the plebs, became a weapon for ambitious politicians. One of the most infamous was Publius Sulpicius Rufus, who, in 88 BCE, proposed transferring command of the war against Mithridates from the aging Sulla to Marius. Sulla, a patrician general, refused, and for the first time in Roman history, a general marched his army on Rome itself. Sulla's troops seized the city. Political enemies were killed. The Republic had been breached not from the outside but from within. This single act, crossing the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome, would become a precedent for later autocrats, including Caesar. The social war and the struggle for citizenship. While Rome fractured within, it also faced rebellion without. In 91 BCE, Italian allies who had fought and died alongside Roman legions demanded full citizenship. They wanted voting rights, legal protection, and recognition as Romans. When the Senate refused, a full-scale revolt erupted, the Social War. Rome eventually prevailed, but only by granting what had been denied citizenship to nearly all of Italy. The Roman state had doubled in size, but not in unity. Rome had expanded, but only through resistance. The Senate in retreat. By the early 1st century BCE, the Senate had lost control. It could not manage reform. It could not manage the army. It could not manage Rome itself. What remained was the illusion of order, senators debating in marble halls, while generals, tribunes, and mobs dictated the real terms of power. The Republic still held elections, but they were often bought. It still held trials, but they were political. It still called itself free, but that freedom was increasingly hollow. The culture of violence. The Republic now accepted what it once feared. That might could make right. That political murder was a strategy, not a crime. That laws could be passed by force and annulled by sword. That the people could be fed with grain, distracted with games, and stirred into mobs. It was not just a political failure, it was a cultural one. Closing reflection. By the time Julius Caesar was born in 100 BCE, the republic he would one day dominate was already dying. It had preserved its forms, elections, assemblies, courts, but hollowed out their meaning. It had passed reforms, then ignored them. It had elevated law, then let it be broken. The Gracchi had warned what would happen when the Republic refused to listen. Marius and Sulla proved what would happen when ambition filled the void. So the question is no longer when the Republic would fall. The question is, when power no longer respects the rules, can the rules survive? Story 4. The Gracchi brothers. Land, reform, and blood in the Forum. Rome in the 2nd century BCE was a city of contradictions. It conquered nations in the east and west, yet could not feed its poor. It celebrated liberty, yet crushed reformers. It built temples to the gods while ignoring the prayers of the landless. And in this moment of widening gaps between rich and poor, tradition and necessity, two brothers emerged who would try to save the Republic by challenging its most sacred assumptions. They were not outsiders. They were not rebels in rags. They were, in fact, the sons of privilege. And that is what made them so dangerous. A noble beginning. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were born into one of Rome's most respected families, the gens Sempronia. Their father, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus the Elder, was a distinguished consul and censor, a man of stern virtue and military accomplishment. Their mother, Cornelia, was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal. Cornelia was widowed young but refused to remarry, despite offers from the highest circles of Roman society, including the king of Egypt. Instead, she devoted herself to raising her children and preserving the values of the old republic: duty, service, simplicity. Later Romans would claim she referred to her sons as her jewels. Whether or not this story is true, it reflects how they were seen as not just individuals, but embodiments of a vanished virtue. Tiberius Gracchus, scholar, soldier, reformer. Tiberius, the elder brother, was refined, composed, and philosophical. Educated in rhetoric and Greek philosophy, he was drawn to questions of justice, duty, and balance in the state. But he was not merely a thinker. As a young man, he served in the army and distinguished himself during the Third Punic War and later in Spain, where he negotiated a treaty that saved thousands of Roman lives. For this, he was criticized by the Senate, who saw the treaty as too lenient. Tiberius learned early that service alone was not enough. The Senate rewarded loyalty to class, not the Republic. This lesson would guide his political path. The agrarian problem. Upon returning to Rome, Tiberius witnessed firsthand the devastation wrought by decades of conquest and inequality. Small farmers had lost their land, many sold into debt or forced into urban poverty. The countryside was dominated by latifundia, huge estates worked by slaves. The Republic's citizen army, once made up of landowners, was in decline. The city swelled with poor citizens dependent on grain handouts, angry and idle. Tiberius saw a republic that was consuming itself from within, its citizens the lifeblood of its military, its assemblies, its temples were being replaced by slaves and neglected by elites. His solution, a return to the mos maiorum, the ancient way, not radical revolution but reform rooted in Roman tradition. The Lex Sempronia Agraria. In 133 BCE, Tiberius was elected tribune of the plebs. As tribune, he proposed the Lex Sempronia Agraria, a land reform law that would enforce existing laws limiting how much public land, ager publicus, any individual could hold, reclaim excess land, and redistribute it in small plots to landless citizens. Offer these new landowners legal titles to ensure security and independence. It was a simple idea: restore the republic by restoring its citizens. But in Rome, simple did not mean safe. Opposition from the Senate. The Senate opposed the law not for its content, the principle had long existed, but for its implications. It threatened the wealth and power of Rome's great families, many of whom had quietly absorbed vast stretches of public land. It challenged the Senate's authority by bypassing its traditional role in legislation. It empowered the plebeian assembly, suggesting that popular will could override aristocratic control. Tiberius, undeterred, pushed the law to a vote. When his fellow tribune, Marcus Octavius, vetoed it, Tiberius asked the assembly to remove him from office. They did. It was legal, but it shattered precedent. No tribune had ever been deposed by popular vote. Tiberius had now redefined what was possible. A law passed, a line crossed. With Octavius removed, the law passed. A land commission was formed composed of Tiberius, his brother Gaius, and his father-in-law Appius Claudius. Thousands of applications poured in. The process was slow, bureaucratic, and controversial, but for many Romans, it was the first time in years they had seen the Republic do something for them. Yet the Senate continued to obstruct. It starved the commission of funds and accused Tiberius of ambition. When Attalus III, king of Pergamum, died and left his kingdom to Rome, Tiberius proposed using the inheritance to fund land redistribution. This enraged the Senate. Foreign policy, they believed, belonged to them, not the tribunes. Tiberius, enemies now claimed he was seeking to make himself king. The second tribunate. As the end of his term approached, Tiberius ran for a second tribunate, legal but unprecedented. To his supporters it was a necessity. The land law needed protection. To his enemies it was proof of tyranny. On the day of the vote, chaos erupted in the forum. Senators, led by the Pontifex Scipio Nasica, armed themselves with stools and cudgels. Tiberius was beaten to death, alongside dozens of his followers. His body was thrown into the Tiber. Closing reflection. Tiberius Gracchus died not as a rebel, but as a citizen trying to restore the Republic's foundations: land, service, dignity. But in doing so, he exposed the deep rot within Rome's institutions. The Senate would rather kill a tribune than allow him to succeed. And once that line had been crossed, once violence entered the forum, it could never fully be removed. The Republic, still standing, had changed forever. And Gaius, watching from the shadows, was already preparing to finish what his brother had begun. Can reform survive in a system that punishes its reformers? Tiberius Gracchus was dead, his body discarded in the Tiber, his name whispered in homes and shouted in the streets. But the cause he had championed, the restoration of land and dignity to Rome's forgotten citizens, did not die with him. Watching from the wings was his younger brother Gaius Gracchus. Where Tiberius had been calm, reserved, almost scholarly, Gaius was fiery, eloquent, and unrelenting. He had seen what the Republic did to those who sought to help the people. And he would return not just to avenge his brother's memory, but to change Rome itself. The return of a Gracchus. Gaius Gracchus spent several years in quiet mourning, serving in minor posts and traveling. But he never forgot. When he finally ran for the tribunate in 123 BCE, the name Gracchus had become both a symbol of hope and a warning. His election was overwhelming. Unlike Tiberius, Gaius entered office with the knowledge that reform required more than just one law. It needed infrastructure, allies, protection, and most of all, strategy. Gaius did not start with land. He started with legitimacy. A broad agenda. Gaius Gracchus rolled out a comprehensive series of laws, tackling nearly every aspect of Roman dysfunction. His goals were bolder and his reforms broader. 1. Judicial reform. Gaius changed the makeup of juries in corruption courts, quaestions repetendi. Previously, senators judged senators, unsurprisingly leading to frequent acquittals. Gaius transferred these juries to the equestrian order, the wealthy non-senatorial class. It was a clear rebuke of senatorial impunity. 2. Grain subsidies. He introduced a law fixing the price of grain sold to citizens, a precursor to the later grain dole. It was a stabilizing policy for the urban poor and ensured popular support. 3. Military provision. He pushed for the state to supply clothing and equipment to soldiers, reducing the financial burden on the poor who filled the legions. 4. Colonization. Gaius proposed establishing Roman colonies for landless citizens not just in Italy, but abroad. One proposed site was at the ruins of Carthage. Though controversial, it symbolized a shift. Rome wasn't just a city, it was an empire, and citizens deserved a stake in it. 5. Citizenship expansion. Perhaps his most ambitious and fatal proposal, to extend Roman citizenship to Latin allies and partial rights to Italian allies. It was just but deeply unpopular. Many Roman citizens feared that expanding citizenship would dilute their privileges, especially voting power and access to grain. For the first time, the people turned against Gracchus. The Senate strikes back. The Senate was terrified. Gaius was wildly popular, brilliantly articulate, and politically skilled. He did not break the law, he bent it masterfully. He spoke in controlled tones. He appealed to tradition. But every speech carried an undercurrent. The Republic has failed you, and I will fix it. The Senate tried to block him the old-fashioned way through rhetoric and procedure. But when that failed, they turned to provocation. They elevated a political rival, Lucius Opimius, and supported him as a candidate for consul. When Gaius stood for a third tribunate, he lost. The tide was turning. Blood in the forum again. The final confrontation began with a symbolic insult. The Senate ordered the dismantling of a colony Gaius had helped found. In protest, his supporters gathered on the Aventine Hill. A scuffle broke out. A Senate supporter was killed, some say by accident, some say by design. The Senate seized its opportunity. It invoked the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree, granting the consul authority to protect the Republic by any means necessary. Opimius led an armed force into the streets. Gaius, knowing the end was near, fled with a single slave to a sacred grove by the Tiber. There, he ordered the slave to kill him before capture. The body of the slave was found beside him, still gripping the knife. Aftermath and consequences. Opimius conducted mass executions over 3,000 citizens, many without trial. Property was confiscated. Supporters were silenced. The reformers were buried, literally and politically. Yet Gaius Gracchus could not be erased. His reforms had touched too many, reached too deeply. The grain subsidy remained. The judicial reform reshaped Roman courts. The idea of colonization as social policy would become standard. And perhaps most enduringly, Gaius had proved that reform could come through political channels, but that Rome's elite would use violence when threatened. The legacy of the Gracchi. Together, the Gracchi brothers reshaped the Republic not through conquest, but through domestic confrontation. They revealed the cost of caring too much in a system that cared too little. Their enemies accused them of seeking tyranny, but their actions suggest otherwise. Neither raised a private army. Neither sought dictatorship. Both used legal mechanisms available to them. Both died without resisting arrest. Their crime was to imagine a republic that served all its citizens. Later politicians like Julius Caesar would claim to walk in their footsteps, but unlike the Gracchi, Caesar would command legions. The Gracchi carried only laws and were killed for it. Closing reflection. Gaius Gracchus died in a sacred grove, alone but for a loyal slave. His brother had died 10 years earlier, in the very forum he sought to heal. Both tried to restore a fatting republic and were destroyed by the system they tried to save. Their reforms were incomplete, their lives cut short, but their warning endured. That when the republic refuses to listen to its people, it teaches them to listen instead to those who promise order at any cost. The question that now haunted Rome was no longer who will reform the republic. It was, who will control it? Story 5, Cato the Younger, Stoicism, Stubbornness, and the Fall of the Republic. By the time Marcus Porcius Cato was born in 95 BCE, the Republic was already cracking. Rome had bled its enemies dry but failed to nourish its own citizens. Generals ruled like kings. The Senate had become a playground for the rich. And yet, in this fatting light of Roman virtue, a boy was born who believed in something old, something hard, something vanishing. He was not a revolutionary. He was not a visionary. He was something rarer, a believer. Marcus Cato, later known as Cato the Younger, would become one of the most admired and maddening figures in Roman history. To some, he was a martyr for liberty. To others, a symbol of moral arrogance. But to Cato himself, he was simply doing what was right even when it was doomed. A family of tradition. Cato belonged to the Porcii, an ancient plebeian family that had risen to prominence during the Republic's earlier days. His great-grandfather, Cato the Elder, also known as Cato the Censor, had been a model of Roman virtue. Frugal, disciplined, disdainful of Greek luxuries, and uncompromising in matters of tradition. Cato the Younger grew up in the long shadow of this ancestor, taught to emulate him, to be him. His upbringing was severe. He was orphaned young and raised in the house of his maternal uncle, Marcus Livius Drusus, who was himself a reformer later assassinated for his proposals to broaden citizenship. It was in this household, surrounded by political debate and personal loss, that Cato formed his worldview, principled, stoic, and hostile to compromise. Early displays of character. Stories from Cato's childhood became Roman folklore. As a boy, he refused to flatter Sulla, even under pressure. He showed disdain for bribes and favoritism. He fasted, trained, and studied with extreme discipline. He wept only at the injustice of others, not his own suffering. He was not naturally charismatic nor given to theatrical gestures. He was steady, controlled, and intense. When he spoke, it was with gravity. When he acted, it was with purpose. These qualities won him few friends, but lasting respect. The Stoic Creed. Cato studied philosophy, particularly Stoicism, a school that emphasized reason, virtue, and indifference to pleasure or pain. For a Stoic, the goal was not happiness, but integrity. One must act according to reason and duty, regardless of consequences. This philosophy was deeply Roman in its austerity, and Cato wore it like armor. He rejected luxury. He wore simple clothes. He walked through the streets without attendants. He studied law obsessively and never spoke in the Senate unless he had something of weight to say. To his followers, he was the embodiment of old Roman virtue. To others, he was an inflexible nuisance. Early political career. Cato rose through the cursus honorum, the sequence of public offices, with deliberate steadiness. He served as quaestor, a financial officer in Sicily, where he shocked the locals by refusing bribes and actually reducing tax burdens. When called to account for every coin spent, Cato provided exact records. He then became tribune of the plebs and later a senator. Throughout, he acted as a watchdog against corruption. He prosecuted governors for embezzlement. He supported legislation to strengthen accountability, and he never missed a Senate session. Cato's influence did not lie in political maneuvering. It lay in moral intimidation. Others might compromise for expediency. Cato would not. Friend of the law, enemy of the times. As Rome slid further into political violence and populist manipulation, Cato positioned himself as a defender of the mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. This put him at odds with almost every major political figure of his time. Pompey the Great, who sought glory and exceptional powers. Crassus, who pursued wealth and influence with ruthless pragmatism. Julius Caesar, whose populist tactics and ambition would soon challenge the Republic itself. Cato did not fear their power, he feared their disregard for principle. He opposed bills even when they were popular, if he believed they undermined the law. And when necessary, he filibustered, literally speaking, until nightfall to prevent votes. This rigid adherence to law over popularity made him both revered and reviled. The Catilinarian conspiracy. In 63 BCE, a plot to overthrow the Republic led by Lucius Sergius Catilina was uncovered by Cicero, then consul. Catiline had planned to assassinate senators and seize control of the government. Cato, a senator at the time, urged immediate execution of the conspirators. Others, like Julius Caesar, argued for exile, citing legal and moral restraint. But Cato's speech in the Senate was thunderous: "Let them die." The Senate listened. The conspirators were executed without trial, a legally murky act, but politically decisive. Cato was hailed as a savior of the Republic. But the event also exposed a fracture. Caesar's opposition was noted. His supporters began to gather strength. A storm was coming. Closing reflection. Marcus Cato was a man from another era, born into a world that no longer believed in the values he lived by. He did not adapt. He did not bend. He believed the Republic could be saved through virtue alone. But in a city of bribes, mobs, and ambition, virtue was not a winning strategy. And yet, Cato refused to let it go. He believed that losing honorably was better than winning through compromise. As Rome began its slide toward civil war, Cato stood in the Senate like a marble statue, unmoving, unchanging. But what happens when the Republic needs flexibility, and all it has left is stone? By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Republic was spiraling. The Senate, once a council of wise aristocrats, had become the preserve of power brokers. Elections were bought. Debates were guarded by armed gangs. Alliances were temporary, and loyalty belonged to the highest bidder. In this maelstrom stood Cato the Younger, a man of another age, an unflinching statue of moral certainty, trying to hold back the tides of corruption, ambition, and tyranny. But his greatest test was still to come, and his greatest adversary would not be Crassus, nor Pompey, but Julius Caesar. Caesar and the populars. Julius Caesar, born in 100 BCE, was everything Cato was not. Charismatic, eloquent, and popular with the masses. willing to stretch or ignore the law for results. A man of ambition, cloaked in the language of reform. Caesar presented himself as a leader for the people, in contrast to the Optimates, the Senate's conservative elite, of which Cato was a proud standard-bearer. Though Caesar had patrician blood, he positioned himself as the heir to the Gracchi. He distributed land, canceled debts, and courted the poor. To Cato, this was demagoguery masked tyranny. Cato saw in Caesar not reform, but revolution. And so began a personal and political rivalry that would consume them both. The First Triumvirate. In 60 BCE, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus formed an informal political alliance, the First Triumvirate. Though not an official body, it dominated Roman politics through raw influence, wealth, and patronage. Cato opposed it fiercely. He obstructed their legislation. He gave endless speeches. He accused them of undermining the Republic. His methods were old: debate, delay, appeal to law. The triumvirs used newer methods: violence, bribes, and populist spectacle. Still, Cato held enough sway to frustrate their plans, but every act of obstruction made him more isolated. To many Romans, Cato was no longer a defender of liberty. He was a roadblock. The consulship crisis. In 59 BCE, Caesar was elected consul. Cato tried to block his land reform bill, which promised land to Pompey's veterans. Caesar took the bill directly to the people. Cato filibustered in the Senate, speaking until sunset to prevent a vote. Caesar had him dragged from the chamber. To Caesar, it was a bold move. To Cato, it was a constitutional insult. He refused to yield. Caesar then passed the law without Senate approval. Rome had begun to bypass its own institutions. Cato had won the argument but lost the power. Cato sent to Cyprus. As punishment, or perhaps to remove him from the city, Cato was sent in 58 BCE to annex Cyprus and manage its assets. He did so with characteristic rigor and honesty. He took no bribes, collected funds meticulously, and returned with Rome's largest single financial windfall from a province in that era. But his absence only strengthened Caesar. Upon returning, Cato found a Senate further weakened, and Caesar preparing for his proconsular command in Gaul, one that would last 10 years, giving him unmatched military power. Cato warned, Rome is arming its own conqueror. He was right, but no one listened. The Republic cracks. Over the next decade, Caesar conquered Gaul and became a hero to the masses. Cato watched with alarm as Caesar's popularity eclipsed that of the Senate. His victories brought treasure, soldiers, and loyalty. When Crassus died in Parthia and Pompey drifted back toward the Optimates, the balance collapsed. Rome now faced a choice: Caesar or the Senate. In 49 BCE, the Senate ordered Caesar to relinquish his army. Cato backed the decree. Caesar refused and crossed the Rubicon River with his legions, violating Roman law. Civil war had begun. Cato at war. Cato did not fight as a general but as a statesman. He supported Pompey, believing that Caesar's ambition must be stopped, even if it meant war. But the war did not go well for the Senate's forces. After defeats in Italy and Greece, the Optimates regrouped in Africa. Cato, now stationed in Utica in modern-day Tunisia, governed with restraint and dignity. He refused to steal from the locals. He protected citizens. He insisted on justice even in wartime. Yet the end was near. The end at Utica. In 46 BCE, Caesar won the decisive battle of Thapsus. His forces crushed the Senate's army. Many of Cato's allies surrendered. Caesar, eager to show magnanimity, sent word that Cato's life would be spared. He offered him a pardon. But for Cato, there could be no compromise. To accept Caesar's mercy was to accept Caesar's authority. And so, in the night, After reading Plato's Phaedo, a dialogue on the soul and death, Cato fell on his sword. When the wound did not kill him, he tore it open with his bare hands. Reactions and aftermath. Caesar was reportedly shaken. He had wanted Cato alive not as a friend, but as a trophy. To his supporters, Cato became a martyr for Republican liberty. To his critics, a stubborn fool who chose death over adaptation. To later thinkers Cicero, Seneca, Dante, and even Enlightenment philosophers, Cato became a symbol of resistance, of virtue, of principle over power. Closing reflection. Marcus Cato died as he lived unyielding, precise, loyal to principle over comfort. But the republic he tried to defend no longer existed. It had become too corrupt, too violent, too dependent on men like Caesar to fix the problems it refused to face. Cato's death was noble but also tragic, because it proved that virtue alone cannot stop ambition, that the law without power is a statue in a storm. So the question remains, when the world changes, is it more courageous to adapt or to refuse? Marcus Porcius Cato lay dead in Utica, not at the hands of Caesar, nor by the sword of an enemy, but by a choice deliberate and final. In a republic where politics had become violence and power had consumed principle, Cato's suicide became more than a death. It became a statement. But what happens after a symbol dies? This final section explores how Cato's life, and more importantly, his death, echoed through the dying years of the Republic and into the imperial centuries that followed. Even as Rome transformed into an empire ruled by emperors, the ghost of Cato the Younger refused to fade. Immediate aftermath. Caesar's victory, Cato's myth. In 46 BCE, Caesar emerged as Rome's uncontested master. The Senate remained in name, but it bowed to his will. Reforms were passed at his command. Honors were voted to him automatically. Statues were raised. Coins bore his image. Yet despite all this power, Caesar could not control the meaning of Cato's death. Cato had denied him the satisfaction of clemency. He had denied him the narrative of mercy. And worst of all, he had denied him legitimacy. Cato had made Caesar's victory look like tyranny, not triumph. Cicero, Rome's most famous orator, penned a eulogy titled Cato, praising his virtue, his sacrifice, and his commitment to liberty. In response, Caesar commissioned a counter-pamphlet, Anti-Cato. It did not succeed. Cato had already become legend. Stoic icon. In the years that followed, Cato became the model of the Stoic hero, the man who remains morally upright even as the world collapses around him. Stoic philosophers praised his unyielding integrity. Seneca, the imperial advisor and Stoic writer, quoted Cato often as an exemplar of the sage, free, fearless, incorruptible. He became a reference point not just for ethics but for politics. In a world increasingly ruled by emperors, he symbolized what had been lost, the republic and the citizen who served it. In the eyes of the emperors, to the emperors who followed Caesar Augustus, Tiberius, Nero, Cato's legacy was troublesome. He had no army. He passed no sweeping legislation. He left behind no sons. Yet his name persisted in whispers and writings as the embodiment of the free man in an unfree world. Augustus, though claiming to restore the republic, carefully avoided referencing Cato. To remind people of Cato was to remind them that the republic had been worth preserving. But the people remembered anyway. Even under tyranny, a story survives. A symbol for all sides. In time, Cato's image was claimed by many causes. Republicans revered him as a martyr for liberty. Conservatives praised his defense of tradition. Reformers admired his incorruptibility. Stoics held him as a spiritual ideal. Historians saw him as the man who tried and failed to save a collapsing system. No one could agree on exactly who Cato was, but all agreed he had stood for something, and in a Rome where so many stood for nothing but survival, that alone was remarkable. The irony of the martyr. Despite the romanticization, Cato's life was full of irony. He defended a Senate that had long ceased to deserve defending. He fought to preserve procedures that had been gutted of meaning. He believed in law and order, yet his unwavering loyalty may have hastened the fall of the Republic by making reform impossible. Was he right to resist compromise, or would a more pragmatic approach have preserved liberty longer? Historians still debate this. But Cato never wavered, and perhaps that was the point. Cato's influence on later centuries. Cato's legacy did not end with Rome. During the Renaissance, humanists rediscovered his story. Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu and Voltaire praised his defense of liberty. In the 18th century, Addison's play Cato became a sensation quoted by George Washington, admired by John Adams, and referenced in debates leading to the American Revolution. The words "give me liberty" or "give me death" echoed Cato's own fatal choice. Cato, the Roman who had died in a provincial city on the edge of defeat, had become a universal symbol. Final thoughts on Cato's republic. By the time Augustus became the first emperor in 27 BCE, the republic was dead in all but name. It would linger for another 500 years in the East, but the spirit Cato had fought for citizen governance, law over man, duty over ambition was gone. Cato had failed, but in failing, he preserved something that no conqueror could erase, the idea that principle matters. Not because it wins, but because it outlasts power. Closing reflection. Cato the Younger never raised a sword against Rome. He raised his voice. He raised his pen. He raised the standard of conduct higher than the Senate, the Forum, or the people were willing to reach. And in the end, when Rome chose power over principle, he chose death over compromise. Was he stubborn? Yes. Was he impractical? Certainly. But in a world sliding into tyranny, his refusal to bend became a kind of freedom. So the question remains, is it more honorable to die with your principles intact or to live in a world without them? Story 6. Bread and Bureaucracy, Daily Life in an Imperial Province. When one thinks of the Roman Empire, one imagines generals, emperors, and conquests, legions crossing rivers, marble forums echoing with speeches, intrigue in the Senate. But for most of Rome's history and most of its people, life was none of these things. It was paperwork. This is the story of Gaius Flavius, a mid-level Roman functionary in the province of Aegyptus, Egypt under Roman control in the 1st century CE. His name has not survived in any grand text, but men like him made the empire run, slowly, frustratingly, reliably. They did not win wars, they filed grain records. They did not become famous, they balanced accounts. And without them, there would have been no Rome. The world of the provinces. By 30 BCE, Egypt had been annexed into the Roman Empire after the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Unlike other provinces, it was considered the personal property of the emperor. No senator could enter without imperial permission. The grain from Egypt was Rome's lifeline. The province was managed by a powerful praefectus Aegypti, but beneath him were layers of bureaucracy. Roman administrators, Greek-speaking scribes, native village elders, and scribbled ledgers as far as the eye could see. In the bustling town of Oxyrhynchus, nestled on a branch of the Nile, a small office with clay floors and dusty papyrus stacks was the domain of Gaius Flavius. Who was Gaius Flavius? Not a soldier, not a senator, not a philosopher. Gaius was a legist, a financial administrator, somewhere between an accountant and a tax collector. His duties were many, his prestige minimal, and his daily life filled with minutiae. He wore simple linen robes in the heat. His Latin was fluent but rarely used. Most of his correspondence was in Greek, the administrative language of Egypt since the Ptolemies. He rose early, drank watered wine or a barley beverage, and walked to his office to begin another day of empire building. With ink, the bureaucratic machine. In the office of Gaius Flavius, one would find stacks of tax receipts from landowners, grain reports knotting bushels owed to the imperial granary, complaints from villagers disputing water usage, requests for exemptions due to flood or famine, edicts from the governor, poorly copied by sleepy scribes, census reports littered with errors and corrections. Each document mattered. Each was signed, sealed, and stored in clay jars or wooden chests. Most were forgotten, but they ensured the empire had grain, soldiers were paid, and chaos did not spread. Flavius's days were long and repetitive, but not without risk. Bureaucrats who failed in their duties were fined or demoted. Corruption was common. Bribes flowed like the Nile. Flavius, though cautious, was not incorruptible. A payment here to overlook a shortfall, a favor there to speed a land claim, nothing egregious, but enough to remind one that Rome was not built by angels. The rhythm of the year. Roman Egypt operated by an agricultural calendar tied to the Nile's flooding. Akhit inundation. Mid-July to mid-November, fields flooded, sowing impossible, taxes collected from prior harvest. Parrot emergence. Mid-November to mid-March, planting and bureaucratic planning. Shemu harvest. Mid-March to mid-July, crops reaped, taxes assessed again. During Parrot, Gaius Flavius was busiest. He dispatched tax assessors to villages, verified yields, and ensured quotas for the annona, the grain supply of Rome. His ledgers were double-checked, stamped by superiors and forwarded to Alexandria, then to Rome itself. Most of the time, Rome never looked at them. But mistakes, those were noticed. A life in shadows. Gaius Flavius lived alone in a rented house near the market square. He employed one Greek-speaking slave to cook and carry messages. He had no family nearby, though he occasionally wrote to a sister in Rome. His letters, never preserved, likely spoke of the heat, the monotony, and the slow erosion of idealism. He once dreamed of being a legal advocate. He studied rhetoric, but a cousin secured him a post in Egypt, and he never returned. He paid local musicians to perform on festival days. He drank more often than he should have. He once had an affair with a widowed papyrus merchant, but it ended when she moved north. No monument bears his name. No poem praises his service. But every bushel of grain that reached Rome, every soldier fed on the Rhine, owed something to men like him. Oxyrhynchus, a city preserved by trash. It is thanks to places like Oxyrhynchus that we know Gaius's world. Centuries later, British archaeologists digging in the city's garbage heaps unearthed thousands of papyri, receipts, contracts, census lists, and personal letters. It is likely that someone like Gaius Flavius, bored or hurried, tossed outdated reports into the rubbish. These scraps, unremarkable then, became treasures now. We read of tax disputes over olive trees, petitions from villagers begging relief, lists of oxen, and scribbled notes about unpaid debts. In these forgotten documents, we see the true machinery of Rome, not just swords and marble, but ink and sandals, mud brick offices and wax tablets. A bureaucrat's quiet power. Though invisible, men like Flavius wielded a kind of soft power. They interpreted imperial edicts. They influenced who received tax relief. They managed labor rosters for public works. They decided which complaints reached the ears of the governor. Flavius did not change history, but he shaped the lives of thousands quietly, anonymously, behind a reed pen and an oil lamp. Closing reflection. When Rome fell centuries later, it did not fall in a blaze of glory. It rusted. It was papered over with misfiled tax forms, missing grain shipments, and unpaid levies. Men like Gaius Flavius disappeared not because they were irrelevant, but because the system they upheld had grown too brittle to support them. His life may have been mundane, but it was essential. And so we are left to wonder. In the end, is history shaped more by emperors with swords or by clerks with ledgers? The Roman Empire may have spread through the force of legions, but it was maintained by the tedious and unseen work of bureaucrats. In Egypt, this machinery functioned with remarkable precision and elaborate apparatus of scribes, tax collectors, temple registrars, census agents, and supply officers. And at its middle level, pressed under the weight of orders from above and protests from below, was our functionary, Gaius Flavius, legistes of the Oxyrhynchite nome. If Section 1 offered a glimpse into his personal life and daily rhythm, here we dive deeper into the system he served. A system whose complexity was astonishing, whose impact was profound, and whose collapse centuries later would leave only papyrus fragments in the desert sand. The census, counting the empire. Every 14 years, Egypt underwent a census more frequent than in other parts of the empire. It was meticulous, far-reaching, and anxiety-inducing for the average citizen. Gaius Flavius oversaw part of the process in his nome. Heads of households were required to register themselves, their dependents, slaves, and landholdings. Ages were recorded, professions noted, disabilities sometimes listed. Those who failed to register were fined or imprisoned. Every record had to be copied, reviewed, filed. The goal, ensuring proper taxation and military readiness. Young men were counted for potential conscription. Landowners were tallied for tax assessments. The census forms Flavius reviewed were rarely truthful. Underreporting was common. Claims of illness, lost records, or miscommunication were frequent. But the empire demanded numbers, and Flavius provided them. With corrections, with late fees, with signatures, temples and tax privileges. Though Rome often seemed secular, religion played a logistical role, especially in Egypt, where temples served not just spiritual needs, but also economic functions. Temples owned land often rented to farmers, livestock managed by local herdsmen, laborers who were often exempt from certain civic duties, granary storing tithes and surplus. For Gaius Flavius, temples were a bureaucratic headache. He was required to verify exemptions, ensure that temple lands were not used for personal profit, record donations, bequests, and temple staff rosters. Conflicts were common. A village elder might claim a priest owed taxes. A priest might cite sacred law exempting him. A tenant farmer might disappear during tax season, leaving the temple and the administrator in dispute. Flavius walked a delicate line, too harsh, and the priests protested to Alexandria, too lenient, and his quotas fell short. He often resolved such issues with long letters, careful language, and on occasion a coin or two passed discreetly across the table. Grain, labor, and the annona. Perhaps the single most important duty of Flavius was contributing to the annona Rome's state-run grain supply system. Each district had quotas to fulfill. In Egypt, this grain would be shipped down the Nile to Alexandria, then by sea to Rome's port at Ostia. To meet his quota, Flavius had to track harvest reports from hundreds of smallholders, assign transport obligations. Farmers were often required to carry their grain at their own cost. Record shortages due to flood, blight, or theft. Organize grain levies when harvests fell short. The work was unforgiving. If quotas were not met, Flavius had to explain himself either by citing exceptional circumstances with documentation or by proposing additional levies. He hated the additional levies. They brought protests, petitions, and protests. One of Flavius's daily tasks was reviewing petitions, official complaints from citizens, farmers, artisans, or fellow bureaucrats. They ranged from the tragic to the absurd. A farmer claims his neighbor diverted a canal. A widow accuses a grain official of extortion. A village claims wild pigs destroyed their barley. A mason complains that his son was mistakenly conscripted. A priest demands an apology for being referred to as a minor functionary. Each petition was copied in triplicate. Each had to be responded to either with an imperial citation, a fine, a rejection, or a referral to a higher official. Flavius handled 10-20 of these per day, with the help of his Greek-speaking assistant, Menandros, who occasionally added sarcastic notes in the margins. Petitioners often waited in long lines, bearing small bribes hidden in oil flasks, or loaves of bread, or once an unusual duck. Flavius took the duck, he liked ducks. Village bureaucracy, the scribal web. Though Gaius Flavius sat in a town, his responsibilities extended across dozens of rural villages. Each village had a comarch's village headman, a scribe responsible for copying all communications, a granary manager tasked with counting every grain measure, a watchman to enforce labor orders and collect delinquent taxes. Flavius coordinated with these local agents via letters sent by couriers, or on occasion, scribes on donkeys. Messages were slow, frequently misinterpreted, and often arrived late. When villages resisted or defaulted, he could order temporary arrests of officials, reassignment of quotas to neighboring villages, public shamming via notices posted in the town square. Most problems were solved quietly. But in bad years, especially following a poor Nile flood, the tension rose. Flavius once oversaw a village audit that resulted in 3 resignations, 2 arrests, and the loss of a sheep that apparently could read. The sheep was never found. Imperial oversight. While Flavius wielded regional authority, he was not beyond scrutiny. The prefect in Alexandria reviewed yearly reports. Traveling inspectors, called epistratega, occasionally arrived unannounced. They evaluated performance, heard complaints, and ensured that no official grew too independent. In one such inspection, Flavius was reprimanded for overpaying village scribes. Another time, he was commended for reducing transport losses by using sealed grain jars. These reviews mattered. Good reports brought bonuses and the possibility of transfer to a better district. Poor reports could mean reassignment to some arid corner of Libya. Flavius wanted to retire in Alexandria. He never did. Closing reflection. Rome's bureaucracy may seem dull, but it was immense, and for centuries it worked. Taxes were collected, roads maintained, grain delivered, laws enforced. Not because of genius generals or visionary emperors. Because of men like Gaius Flavius, who rose each day, sharpened his reed pen, and entered his records. So as we reflect on his quiet diligence, we must ask, can any civilization endure without the tedium that holds it together? By the early 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire was at its territorial height. From Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, it ruled over 60 million people. Roads spanned continents, aqueducts brought water to cities, and grain shipments fed entire populations. And yet, the great imperial machine still depended on its most fragile component, the people who made the bureaucracy work. Among them was Gaius Flavius, a middle-aged legist whose name, like those of thousands of his peers, is lost to history. His legacy left not in monuments, but in paperwork. The limits of the system. In 117 CE, the death of Emperor Trajan brought new pressures to the empire. The economy tightened, inflation crept in, and the bureaucracy, though still vast, began to show signs of wear. For Flavius, nearing the end of his career, these shifts were not abstract. His reports were increasingly urgent. Grain shortages were rising in several nomes. Temples were defaulting on payments. Laborers were migrating to cities, abandoning irrigation systems. Complaints about conscription, forced labor, and tax brutality were multiplying. Each month brought new mandates from Alexandria: more precise grain tallies, stricter punishments for delinquents, higher quotas. The paperwork became heavier. But the paper didn't make people work harder. If anything, it slowed them down. The man behind the ledger. Gaius Flavius had once been diligent, not a visionary but fair, practical. He believed in the system, or at least in his ability to manage it. Now, after 3 decades of service, he felt only fatigue. He began sleeping later. His handwriting, once neat and practiced, grew less consistent. His assistant, Menandros, increasingly handled correspondence, responding in the same polite but bored Greek. Flavius rarely walked through the market anymore. He drank more wine. He reread old letters from Rome. He made a list of things he meant to do after retirement. Visit Alexandria's library, tour the temples in Memphis, sit by the river without a wax tablet in his lap. He never did. Death and the ledger. Flavius died sometime around 120 CE, likely in his small home outside Oxyrhynchus. No great procession marked his passing. No grave inscription has been found. He was replaced within weeks by a younger official, Marcus Heliodoros, who immediately filed complaints about the state of the records left behind. But among the papyri uncovered centuries later in the desert rubbish heaps were sheets in Flavius's careful hand, a receipt for barley, a petition approval, a grain transport order bearing his signature, now brown with age. No one in Rome read them at the time. But they survived. Oxyrhynchus and the ruins of order. The city Flavius served eventually declined. By the 4th century, tax burdens had grown unbearable. Villages collapsed under levies. Bureaucrats became predators. Some documents from the time speak of people abandoning homes to escape paperwork, not war, not plague, but paperwork. Eventually, the documents stopped. The city faded. Its records, once meticulously copied, signed, and stored, were thrown into pits and burned for fuel. Others were buried under collapsing buildings. Then, 1,800 years later, archaeologists appeared, sifting through trash. And in those piles, they found Rome not the glory of conquest, but the slow, grinding labor of empire. The work of men like Flavius, whose lives were measured in forms filed, receipts stamped, and deadlines met. The unseen backbone. Gaius Flavius may not have been brave, brilliant, or beloved, but he was useful, and that utility, multiplied by thousands like him, made Rome governable. Even now, scholars pore over the Oxyrhynchus papyri to learn how farmers measured fields, how women petitioned for legal rights, how temples managed slaves and land, how the empire collapsed from the edges inward. And in these details, we find truth that history is not just shaped by heroes, but by habit. Not just by rebellion, but by routine. Not just by war, but by work. Final reflection. The empire Flavius served would last another 300 years in the West and nearly 1,000 in the East. But it would never again be so stable, so quietly efficient. And while we may forget the emperors and senators of his time, we remember him in an unexpected way, not through story or statue, but in a papyrus margin, inked by a weary hand. So as we file our taxes, fill our forms, or groan at red tape, it is worth asking, is the modern world simply a more complex version of Flavius's ledger?